This is the highest possible state of our knowledge when mind fulfills itself in the supramental. Such is the scheme of the human understanding upon which the conclusions of the most ancient Vedanta were built. To develop the results arrived at on this foundation by the ancient sages is not my subject, but it is necessary to pass briefly in review some of their principal conclusions so far as they affect the problem of the divine life, with which alone we are at present concerned. For it is in those ideas that we shall find the best previous foundation of that which we seek now to rebuild, and although, as with all knowledge, old expression has to be replaced to a certain extent by new expression suited to a later mentality, and old light has to merge itself into new light as dawn succeeds dawn, yet it is with the old treasure as our initial capital, or so much of it as we can recover, that we shall most advantageously proceed to accumulate the largest gains in our new commerce with the ever-changeless and ever-changing infinite. Sad Brahman, existence pure, indefinable, infinite, absolute, is the last concept at which Vedantic analysis arrives in its view of the universe. The fundamental reality which Vedantic experience discovers behind all movement and formation which constitute the apparent reality. It is obvious that when we posit this conception, we go entirely beyond what our ordinary consciousness, our normal experience contains or warrants. The senses and sense mind know nothing whatever about any pure or absolute existence. All that our sense experience tells us of is form and movement, the physical aspects. Forms exist, but with an existence that is not pure, rather always mixed, combined, aggregated, relative. When we go within ourselves, we may get rid of precise form, but we cannot get rid of movement of change. We cannot get rid of movement, and we cannot get rid of change. Motion of matter in space, motion of change in time, seem to be the condition of existence. We may say indeed, if we like, that this is existence, and that the idea of existence in itself corresponds to no discoverable reality. The idea of existence in itself corresponds to no discoverable reality. It does not correspond to any discoverable reality. At the most, in the phenomenon of self-awareness or behind it, we get sometimes a glimpse of something immovable and immutable, something that we vaguely perceive or imagine, that we are beyond all life and death, beyond all change and formation and action. Here is the one door in us that sometimes swings open upon the splendor of a truth beyond, and before it shuts again, allows a ray to touch us, a luminous intimation, which, if we have the strength and firmness, we may hold to it in our faith and make a starting point for another play of consciousness than that of the sense mind, for the play of intuition. Because if we examine carefully, we shall find that intuition is our first teacher. Intuition always stands veiled behind our mental operations. Intuition brings to man those brilliant messages from the unknown. I need to underline this paragraph, this is very important. For if we examine carefully, we shall find that intuition is our first teacher. Intuition always stands veiled behind our mental operations. Intuition brings to man those brilliant messages from the unknown, which are the beginning of his higher knowledge. Reason only comes in afterwards, to see what profit it can have of the shining harvest. Intuition gives us that idea of something behind and beyond all that we know and seem to be, which pursues man always in contradiction of his lower reason and all his normal experience, and impels him to formulate that formless perception in the more positive ideas of God, immortality, heaven, and the rest, by which we strive to express it to the mind. For intuition, because intuition is as strong as nature herself, from whose very soul it has sprung, and cares nothing for the contradictions of reason or the denials of experience. It knows what is because itself it is of that and has come from that, and will not yield to the judgment of what merely becomes and appears. What the intuition tells us of is not so much existence as the existent. Listen to this line. What the intuition tells us of is not so much existence as the existent, for it proceeds from that one point of light in us which gives it its advantage, that sometimes open door in our own self-awareness. Ancient Vedanta seized this message of the intuition and formulated it in the three great declarations of the Upanishads: I am He, Thou art that, O Svetaketu. All this is the Brahman, this self is the Brahman. But intuition, by the very nature of its action in man, working as it does from behind the veil, active principally in his more unenlightened, less articulate parts, served in front of the veil, in the narrow light which is our waking conscience, only by instruments that are unable fully to assimilate its messages. Intuition is unable to give us the truth in that ordered and articulated form which our nature demands. Before it could effect any such completeness of direct knowledge in us, it would have to organize itself in our surface being and take possession thereof, the leading part. But in our surface being, it is not the intuition, it is the reason which is organized and helps us to order our perceptions, thoughts, and actions. Therefore, the age of intuitive knowledge, represented by the early Vedantic thinking of the Upanishads, had to give place to the age of rational knowledge. Inspired scripture made room for metaphysical philosophy. Even as afterwards metaphysical philosophy had to give place to experimental science. What a great paragraph. I hope you guys rewind and listen to this section again. Intuitive thought, which is a messenger from the superconscient and therefore our highest faculty, was supplanted by the pure reason, which is only a sort of deputy and belongs to the middle heights of our being. Pure reason in its turn was supplanted for a time by the mixed action of the reason, which lives on our planes and lower elevations and does not in its view exceed the horizon of the experience that the physical mind and senses, or such aids as we can invent for them, can bring to us. And this process, which seems to be a descent, is really a circle of progress. This process, which seems to be a descent, going down, is really a circle of progress. For in each case, the lower faculty is compelled to take up as much as it can assimilate of what the higher had already given, and to attempt to re-establish it by its own methods. By the attempt it is itself enlarged in its scope. And arrives eventually at a more supple and a more ample self-accommodation to the higher faculties. Without this succession and attempt at separate assimilation, we should be obliged to remain under the exclusive domination of a part of our nature, while the rest remained either depressed and unduly subjected, or separate in its field and therefore poor in its development. With this succession and a separate attempt, the balance is righted. A more complete harmony of our parts of knowledge is prepared. By what? With this succession and the separate attempt. We see this succession in the Upanishads and the subsequent Indian philosophies. The sages of the Veda and Vedanta relied entirely upon intuition and spiritual experience. It is by an error that scholars sometimes speak of great debates or discussions in the Upanishad. Wherever there is the appearance of a controversy, it is not by discussion, by dialectics or the use of logical reasoning that it proceeds, but by a comparison of intuitions and experiences in which the less luminous gives place to the more luminous, the narrower, faultier or less essential gives place to the more comprehensive, more perfect and more essential. The question asked by one sage of another is, what dost thou know? Not what dost thou think? Nor to what conclusion has thy reasoning arrived? Nowhere in the Upanishads do we find any trace of logical reasoning urged in support of the truths of Vedanta. Nowhere in the Upanishads do we find any trace of logical reasoning urged in support of the truths of Vedanta. Intuition, the sages seem to have held, must be corrected by a more perfect intuition. Logical reasoning cannot be its judge. And yet, the human reason demands its own method of satisfaction. Therefore, when the age of rationalistic speculation began, Indian philosophers, respectful of the heritage of the past, adopted a double attitude towards the truth they sought. They recognized in the Shruti the earlier results of intuition, or as they preferred to call it, of inspired revelation, an authority superior to reason. But at the same time, they started from reason and tested the results it gave them, holding only those conclusions to be valid which were supported by the supreme authority. In this way, they avoided to a certain extent the besetting sin of metaphysics, the tendency to battle in the clouds because it deals with swords, as if they were imperative facts instead of symbols, which have always to be carefully scrutinized and brought back constantly to the sense of that which they represent. Their speculations tended at first to keep near at the center to the highest and profoundest experience, and proceeded with the united consent of the two great authorities, reason and intuition. Nevertheless, the natural trend of reason to assert its own supremacy triumphed in effect over the theory of its subordination. Hence the rise of conflicting schools, each of which founded itself in theory on the Veda and used its texts as a weapon against the others. For the highest intuitive knowledge, because the highest intuitive knowledge sees things in the whole, in the large, and details only as sides of the indivisible as whole. Listen to this sentence again. Because the highest intuitive knowledge sees things in the whole, in the large, and details only as sides of the indivisible whole. Indivisible whole, its tendency is towards immediate synthesis and the unity of knowledge. Reason, on the contrary, proceeds by analysis and division and assembles its facts to form a whole. But in the assemblage so formed, there are opposites, anomalies, logical incompatibilities, and the natural tendency of reason is to affirm some and to negate others which conflict with its chosen conclusions, so that it may form a flawlessly logical system. What a great line. This sentence basically sums up Western science in one sentence and how it's different from Eastern philosophies. So let's read this section again. Reason, on the contrary, proceeds by analysis and division and assembles its facts to form a whole. But in the assemblage so formed, there are opposites, anomalies, logical incompatibilities, and the natural tendency of reason is to affirm some and to negate others which conflict with its chosen conclusions. Negate those sections which conflict with its chosen conclusions, so that it may form a flawlessly logical system. Heteronormativity and no variety, no diversity. The unity of the first intuitional knowledge was thus broken up, and the ingenuity of the logicians was always able to discover devices, methods of interpretation, standards of varying value by which inconvenient texts of the scripture could be practically annulled, and an entire freedom acquired for their metaphysical speculation. Nevertheless, the main conceptions of the earlier Vedanta remained in parts in the various philosophical systems, and efforts were made from time to time to recombine them into some image of the old Catholicity and unity of intuitional thought. And behind the thought of all, variously presented, survived as the fundamental conception Purusha, Atman, or sad Brahman, the pure existent of the Upanishads, often rationalized into an idea or psychological state, but still carrying something of its old burden of inexpressible reality. This is the problem. This is the problem why Hindus are so prone to becoming atheists, because they don't understand religion, or if they do, they can't explain it to anyone else, so they feel frustrated. Because as Aurobindo points out, it's an inexpressible reality. What may be the relation? Because his preference is on intuition, and intuition will always be an inexpressible reality. What may be the relation to the movement of the movement of becoming, which is what we call the world to this absolute unity, and how the ego, whether generated by the movement or cause of the movement, or cause of the movement, can return to that true self, divinity or reality declared by the Vedanta? These were the questions, speculative and practical, which have always occupied the thought of India.